don't we know about the Chernobyl disaster? Adam Higginbotham will be here to talk about his new book, Midnight in Chernobyl, The Untold Story of the World's Greatest Nuclear Disaster. How did coding become a massive and growing profession? Nellie Bowles will be here to talk about Clive Thompson's new book, Coders. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. And one final bonus, to celebrate and honor National Poetry Month, we'll have a special reading by a special poet. This is the Book Review Podcast. I'm Pamela Paul. Adam Higginbotham joins us now. His new book is called Midnight in Chernobyl, The Untold Story of the World's Greatest Nuclear Disaster. Adam, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So what drew you to the subject of Chernobyl?
Well, initially, when I started reporting on the subject back in 2006, I was interested in finding out the stories of people who'd been eyewitnesses to what had happened. And I was kind of inspired by the fact that I'd recently read Walter Lord's A Night to Remember.
About the Titanic.
About the sinking of the Titanic, which is this, incredible and concise book, which reconstructs just the night of the sinking of the Titanic through interviews that Lord conducted in the years after the sinking with people who'd survived. And I'd read the existing literature on the Chernobyl accident, and I just thought that there was this really great opportunity to write, a long magazine piece that reconstructed the night in the words of the people or through the experiences of the people that had been there. But then when I began interviewing them, I realized that, the existing accounts had huge holes in them and didn't really reflect the full reality of what had happened. And then I went back again to Ukraine to do further reporting on the story in 2011, around the 25th anniversary of the accident. And during that visit, I did some things during the reporting that really frightened me. And, I remember sitting in this hotel room in the town of Chernobyl and looking out the window and thinking, I'm never going to come back to this terrible place.
What frightened you?
Oh, I just went into the most radioactive area of the entire exclusion zone. But when I emerged, I realized that I'd got no real sense of what my dose had been. So I had a real insight into how terrifying the kind of the prospect of radiation can be and how insidious the fear it generates is.
But you're in protective gear, right?
No. There's no protective gear that you can wear that would protect you from anything other than the dust. So I was just wearing my regular clothes. I was outside in a forest and just walking around, but there was no protective gear. So I swore in 2011 I'd never go back. And then about 3 years later, I found myself sitting at my desk producing another pitch about a third magazine story. And at that point, I eventually began thinking, well, maybe there's a wider project here.
What kept drawing you back?
I think to begin with, the stories of the people that I spoke to back in 2006 kind of wouldn't let go of me. And then I began to realize the sort of epic scale of the story, because most of the literature that had been published before I began work on this had concentrated on specific aspects of what had happened. So, there were books that talked about the night of the accident and reconstructed in technical detail what happened. And there were books that talked about the ecological aftermath, and there was a lot of, scientific writing about it. And there's Svetlana Alexeyevic's Voices from Chernobyl, which is this sort of, isn't a narrative book, but is a kind of, hallucinatory sense of what it was like for these individuals, but many of whom are unnamed, to have suffered through the accident. But what I wanted to do was to write a character-driven narrative that took the story right from the beginning of the project back in 1970 to the present day. And I realized that there were specific characters within that huge story who could carry the tale through from beginning to end. And if I could find those people and talk to them in enough detail, then I could tell a story unlike any version of the Chernobyl story that I'd read before.
What was it that those people were saying to you that stuck with you? I mean, that you were hearing in their stories that made you want to come back?
I think partly to begin with, it was the fact that I realized that they were not these sort of Slavic stereotypes of drab victims of the socialist experiment. When I started visiting people in Moscow and in Kiev, I began to realize that I had been just as much of a victim of propaganda about what life was like in the Soviet Union as anybody who lived in the Soviet Union at the time of the accident would have been of what life was like in the West. And I was 17 when the accident happened. And some of these guys and some of these women were not much older than me at the time. And so as I began to kind of go into the detail of their stories and most importantly, their background before the accident and their sort of aspirations and expectations of what the future was going to be like, I realized that they were a lot like me. And it was my wish to kind of bring to life these people as real characters, as real people that kept drawing me back.
All right. So given that you were terrified after that second visit because of the exposure, how many times did you go back? And were you nervous then worried about the long-term health implications?
The honest answer is I don't actually know how many times I went back. Enough to lose count of how many times I went back. And I never really stopped being afraid of it. Only because although eventually I did get my own dosimeter so I could keep track of how much radiation I was absorbing with each visit and cumulatively over all that time, the complexities of radiation exposure are such that, somebody like me does not really know what the effect is going to be. But I should say that radiation exposure inside the exclusion zone now, even in the worst places, is pretty minimal and is not going to really hurt you over the long term, as far as I know.
As far as you know. Well, let's go back to what happened at Chernobyl and how much of what happened did we know at the time. So let's go for those who were not 17, maybe weren't even born in 1986. What happened exactly?
What happened was that on the night of April the 25th into the morning of April the 26th, there was a long-delayed safety test that they were going to be carrying out on this reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl plant. And during the course of this safety test that was being conducted during a regular maintenance shutdown, the operators of the reactor inadvertently brought it into a state of extreme instability, which on its own would have been fine. But there were also a series of serious design defects with the reactor that stretched back more than 10 years that the designers of the reactor had known about all this time, but didn't bother really informing anybody about, and certainly didn't bother addressing. And so these design defects and the mistakes made by the operators of the reactor combined in this kind of deadly chain of events and a series of things that individually would not have caused an accident eventually piled up to the point where at the end of the test, which lasted only 36 seconds, when the reactor operator pressed the button to shut the reactor down, one of the most important design defects in the reactor was that the control rods that are designed to shut down the reactor when you press this button for a fraction of a second could actually increase power inside the reactor instead of decreasing it. And because of everything else that had happened up to that point, at the moment when those control rods began descending into the reactor, they set off a chain reaction that was unstoppable. And that led to an explosion. Blew the top off the reactor, destroyed the roof of the reactor building, 2 of the walls of the reactor building, and released this pillar of radioactive contamination into the atmosphere that 3 days later ended up in Sweden. And that was how the world discovered that this accident had happened.
What does something like this look like, right? Because for most people, they think of nuclear power, they think of a nuclear bomb, they think of a mushroom cloud, they think of, a massive disaster that's readily apparent. But this is different. What does it look like? And give us a sense of the scale.
To me, the descriptions of what it looked like that were given to me by the people who were there are actually kind of worse than the imaginary vision of a nuclear accident with a mushroom cloud and stuff. This building was utterly destroyed and looks in photographs as if it had been kind of scooped out by a giant spoon from above. So the building is surrounded by blackened wreckage. In daylight, you could see that there was a wisp of steam or white smoke of some kind wafting out of the top of the building. But what the operators who went out into the street to look at the building immediately after the explosion saw was much, much more frightening, which was this pillar of ethereal blue-white light shooting upwards into the atmosphere, off into infinity. And this was an indication that they'd got a nuclear reactor that was uncovered to the atmosphere.
What was the scale of the disaster? I mean, how much radiation got released and how many people were killed in the immediate explosion?
In the immediate part of the accident, the answer is a lot fewer than most people expect. one man was killed in the course of the explosion, and a second operator died in hospital shortly before dawn from burns he'd sustained immediately after the explosion. And then I think within 5 months, a further 29 people had died in hospital in Moscow or in Kiev from radiation exposure that they took during the hours after the explosion itself, or in attempting to fight the fires that broke out as a result of the explosion. But the long-term effects of the radiation in the environment are a much more controversial question. And, in the years since the accident, arguments have developed that have become quite fundamentalist on both sides. So you'll get boosters of the nuclear industry who will tell you that, 65 people have died in total as a result of the accident. And then you'll have environmental groups that will tell you that hundreds of thousands of people have died of cancer and other diseases as a result. But there's a lot of scientific study has been done on this. And what the science suggests is that out of a population of 5 million people living in the worst affected areas of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, there will be an estimated 5,000 deaths from cancer that would not have happened had this explosion not taken place. And in the broader area, there'll be another 25,000 cancers that will not be fatal that can be attributed to the accident. But the truth is that all of these things are estimates. And in the confusion and the deliberate attempts of the Soviet government to cover things up after the accident happened, data was either not gathered or deliberately concealed, which would have helped us reach better conclusions.
So we know that the world didn't find out about it until Sweden noticed radiation in the atmosphere. Presumably the people that were there immediately knew right away that something seriously wrong had happened. To what extent was Russia aware, and how actively did they suppress the knowledge of what happened from people in Russia, people in the Ukraine at the time?
Well, to begin with, there was a lot of confusion. And I think, from speaking to those people who were there at the time and in charge, they simply couldn't comprehend the enormity of what had happened. And, they simply refused to believe it. And when Gorbachev and the members of the Politburo really began to find out that something terrible had happened, they convened what Gorbachev subsequently in his memoirs described as an emergency Politburo meeting. Mm-hmm. But he regarded it apparently as such an emergency that although the accident happened early on Saturday morning, the meeting took place on Monday morning at 10:30. And then in the discussion that they had there, they debated whether or not they should be completely open about what had happened or whether they should take what was regarded as the traditional route, which was to release a kind of 3-line statement that said that something bad had happened, but it was all being taken care of. And, whatever Gorbachev's intentions toward glasnost and perestroika were at that time, they decided to take the traditional approach, which was to try and sit on it for as long as possible.
There's a city next to it. Is it Pripyat?
That's right, yeah.
Pripyat. How many people were living there? Who was there? What was it like before this disaster? And were they immediately evacuated? What ended up happening to that place?
Well, this is something I was particularly interested to explore in the reporting because it was something that had been written about very little before, what life was like in Pripyat before the accident. And there were almost 50,000 people living there, but it was regarded as a really nice place to live because it was intended as a kind of magnet community to attract nuclear specialists from around the Soviet Union.
Is it 1/3 children?
That's right. The average age of the population was 26. And a third of those were children. And it was, it was an extremely modern, well-appointed place with a scuba diving club, a beauty parlor, its own football team, these modern, newly built apartments that you could get without having to wait on a waiting list. But the people that lived there were not informed that an accident had taken place immediately after the explosion. And they weren't evacuated until almost 36 hours after it had taken place. And this was partly because the Soviet government simply didn't want to admit what had happened. And if they had 50,000 people being evacuated from a city, it would be pretty hard to keep a lid on that information because it would just leak out into the wider part of the country, and then pretty soon people in the West would hear about it. But the people in the city also had been party to information about accidents before. There had been accidents happen at the Chernobyl plant before. And initially, as word began to leak into the city about what had happened in the reactor, which is only 3 kilometers away, nobody was that worried about it because before accidents had happened, but there had been no terrible consequences. So although, there are some versions of the story that would have you believe that these people were deliberately kept in the dark and, they were terrible victims of what had happened, the truth is that they themselves were not that concerned about it when they first heard what had happened, and they just thought that this was another accident which would be cleared up soon enough, and then they could just go back to their normal lives.
Well, you say like just another accident. I mean, were accidents common in the Soviet Union at that time, nuclear power plant accidents?
Accidents of all kinds were common in the Soviet Union at that time, but there had been a fairly major accident, although obviously not one on this scale, at Chernobyl in 1982, which had resulted in radioactive leaks from the plant. But that had been successfully covered up, and they quietly resurfaced the main street leading into Pripyat to cover up the contamination that had fallen there, and just everybody else got on with it and went about their lives as usual.
And yet Chernobyl, in the international imagination or memory, it stands out among nuclear disasters. Why is that? I mean, was it particularly huge in its scale? Was it because of the cover-up? Why is it different from other major nuclear accidents that have occurred?
Because this is the biggest and most devastating nuclear accident in history. Even Fukushima cannot really compare in the amount of radioactivity that was released into the atmosphere. I mean, the biggest difference is the number of people whose lives were upset, overturned, or destroyed by what happened. But I think partly the fascination that people have with it is that it did take place within the Soviet Union at a time when, everything that happened there was something of a mystery. And the cover-up sort of backfired because the Soviet government's attempts to squelch information escaping from Moscow and Kiev meant that the rumors just became much worse. So that, the New York Post published a story in the week after the accident saying that 15,000 people had been killed in this explosion and their bodies buried in a huge pit as radioactive waste somewhere in Ukraine. And those kind of facts, or would-be facts that emerged at the time of the accident, kind of stuck in the public consciousness.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, so people, even now, when I was working on the book and I'd be talking to people at parties and they'd ask me what I was working on, their first question would be, so how many thousand people really died?
Yeah.
And so that misconception alone has really took hold in people's minds.
You mentioned earlier that there were structural problems with the plant, safety issues that were, existed from the construction of the site itself. So was this an accident waiting to happen? I mean, was it kind of inevitable that something like this would occur?
Yes. I mean, in the post-accident analysis that the Politburo had done, they eventually concluded that if it hadn't happened in Chernobyl, then it would have happened at another nuclear plant using this model of reactor somewhere else. And more broadly, kind of Soviet industry and the Soviet state really operated on the basis that there would be no tomorrow, that they could just keep abusing the environment and they could keep building these shoddy enterprises and everything would work out in the end. And, what happened was that tomorrow finally arrived in Chernobyl.
So the question then is, how worried should we be now? Because that was not the only plant built during that era, right? In the Soviet Union. True. Have they gone back and sort of examined the construction of other nuclear plants that are still in operation and made corrections?
Interestingly, what they did in the immediate aftermath of the accident was they tried to conceal information about all of these design defects in order to cover up for the heads of the nuclear industry who were responsible for this. Simultaneously, they launched a series of modifications to address the design defects. So while on one hand they were denying that there was any problem with the reactor, on the other hand, they made all these modifications to address the design defects in the reactor. And in fact, there are 11 RBMK reactors still in operation inside Russia at the moment. And I think they're now extending the lifespan of some of these.
That's reassuring. It is a very gripping story, hopefully one not to occur again. The book again is called Midnight in Chernobyl, The Untold Story of the World's Greatest Nuclear Disaster by Adam Higginbotham. So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Nellie Bowles joins us now from San Francisco. She is a tech and culture reporter for The Times out of San Francisco. And this week, she reviews the new book by Clive Thompson called Coders, The Making of a New Tribe and the Remaking of the World. Nellie, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me on.
So this has a very big subtitle, The Making of a New Tribe and the Remaking of the World. What is Thompson proposing to do in this book?
I mean, it's a big subtitle, but I don't think it's overstating the role that coders have had in our world in the last few years. So what Thompson is trying to do is do an anthropology of who these people are. What are their goals? How do they work? What's the work actually like? How do they get jobs? How do they lose jobs? What makes a good one? What makes a bad one? And so he's basically saying, this is a job and a group of people who have enormous influence on our world. Let's try to understand a little bit of what they're like.
I'm sure there's a hierarchy among coders, and that there are sort of your low-level coders and then your uber coders. But if you could give a sense from what Clive Thompson describes in the book, like what is the day of a life of a coder? And if you have to do it twice for the sort of low level and then for the high level, feel free.
The average life of a coder is you get to work and you're focused usually on very small problems, very small issues every day. You're looking for a bug or you're trying to get one little aspect of something to work. And it's very satisfying in a way because you get that thing to work and then it's done and then you've succeeded for the day. Unlike, journalism where it can always be better or worse or you can always still be working it. And so in a way, what I liked about that is by showing how small the work is, he highlights a little bit how absurd it is that we then expect that person to also be the philosopher understanding the entire broader context of how that system's going to work.
Right.
The daily work of being a coder is just focusing on tiny problems that come up.
So is it what you're saying is that it's important to separate what the actual sort of coders are doing who are creating this code with the political implications down the line for Facebook in South Asia, for example?
Exactly.
So what kind of people go into coding?
It tends to draw people who are interested in solving little riddles every day and little math problems every day. Although, as he sort of learns how to code, it's actually not that hard. Silicon Valley has worked very hard to make code seem incredibly mysterious and complicated, and the Valley benefits from that because then, of course, the rest of the world can't really understand what they're up to, and they can always blame a problem on the algorithm or whatever has gone awry. But he ends the book with miners learning how to code and says, it ends in sort of a really optimistic note about there isn't the sort of secret power of this has been revealed and we can all learn how to do this and it's not that complicated.
So you've done a lot of interviewing people in Silicon Valley with your reporting. Presumably, Clive Thompson did his as well. To what extent does he talk to sort of on-the-ground coders about these issues of gender? And does it align with what you've found in your own reporting?
Totally. And he does a great job of it. He talks to all the right people. He knows this space really well. He's been reporting on this region for a while. The thing that he doesn't totally capture that I wish he had captured a little more is a little bit of the funniness of the Valley and the fun of it. He approaches the subject, which I wrote in the review, but he approaches the subject a little bit like he's doing an autopsy.
Yes, I love that line.
Like something has gone terribly wrong, and we need to figure out what went wrong. Mm-hmm. And that's the tone and frame of the book. And I think that that's true. But it's maybe not quite as fun to read.
Right.
I don't know. That sounds terrible to say. It's true something's gone wrong, but there's also a lot of goofiness and sweetness and loveliness to this work and to this play.
Well, it might be symptomatic of the fact that this book is coming out in 2019 at a time where a lot of people are sort of questioning, like, what hath tech wrought, and looking at some of the negative social or political implications of some of the larger tech companies. But again, what it sounds like what you're saying is that there's sort of a lot of links to get from the coding that's actually created by these workers to this is what ends up happening in, say, Myanmar.
It is very easy and satisfying to blame like a Facebook engineer for these problems and to be like, they're building this thing and not thinking about the implications. But it's sort of like, how can you expect a kid who's just focusing on making sure that like the blue is the blue that you're going to click on more to also be thinking about what that means for viral extremist videos? And Clive actually does a really good job of this. The coders are just sort of in their little nook, doing their little job, focusing on their bugs that day.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the job of society, it's the job of journalists, it's the job of politicians, it's the job of academics, it's the job of everyone else to start taking this work seriously and to start, maybe it'll be regulating it, but certainly just looking at it and understanding it. And so this book is kind of the first step towards that, towards trying to understand this so that other people can come in and say like, okay, let's have a conversation about algorithms and what they mean. And let's have a conversation about design and what it means.
So you mentioned that Clive Thompson knows this world. He's the author of another book that looked at technology called Smarter Than You Think, How Technology is Changing Our Minds for the Better. Longtime writer for Wired as well as for the New York Times Magazine. Do you get a sense that is he coming at this with a particular viewpoint? Is he making some kind of argument in this book, or is this really a sort of on-the-ground, reported, more neutral take?
When I read parts of his first book, I thought, okay, his second book is going to be equally optimistic, and it's going to be sort of a defense of Silicon Valley. Like, it's smarter than you think is basically like, it's all better than you think it is even. Mm-hmm. And these machines are smarter than you think they are. It ended up being quite the opposite. So I was surprised, actually. He manages to write what is in many ways a takedown of Silicon Valley culture, but frames it and phrases it as a book about why we all need to care and get involved and learn to code and understand this world. So even as he's doing a takedown of Silicon Valley culture, he's also making an argument that we all need to learn to code.
Why do we all learn to need to code?
We all need to learn to code because you can't understand what they're doing if you don't understand sort of the basics of what's happening. So not that you need to be able to build a beautiful website or make the Google search algorithm yourself, but that we need to have a basic conversational understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about algorithms. It's so easy and it makes it not magic anymore. And then all of a sudden, we can have real conversations about what these companies are doing and what these people are building.
Because if we don't understand it, then it's easier to maybe place the blame in the wrong place or to create situations.
It's easier for them to hide.
Mm-hmm.
It's easier for them to pretend like it's, they blame the machine, they blame the algorithm when something goes wrong, rather than blaming human error or blaming sort of a very human decision-making process.
About the application of that code.
Exactly. And so by understanding the basics of it, we can start to look at it critically. A lot of the criticism of Silicon Valley from the outside reads as hollow because it comes from folks who have no idea how the place works or how the work looks.
Well, you have an idea of how the place works and how it looks because you've been in that world, reporting on that world for a while. So for the reader who's looking to consider whether to read this book, Coders, The Making of a New Tribe and the Remaking of the World, versus another book about Silicon Valley. I mean, this is not the only book to be written about this world. Where does it fit into that landscape?
I would say if you want to be able to debate about these companies and debate about the software that you're using and seeing, this is a really good book to read for that.
All right. Now I'm going to take advantage of your expertise and your presence here on the podcast to ask you a little bit more about books on Silicon Valley. What's your favorite book? on Silicon Valley?
Ooh, I'd say, I'm a sucker for Nudists on the Late Shift. I loved that one, Poe Bronson.
Mm-hmm.
It's just so fun and so funny, and describes the silliness and the inward looking and the sexism and all of that, but in a way that's just like so readable. I think Silicon Valley is actually like very undercovered in terms of reporting and books still. Oh, but there's the best one, obviously Bad Blood.
The John Carreyrou.
Yes.
What is it about that book?
One thing that Silicon Valley does so well is convince everyone that it's like these special geniuses, right? And that no one can really understand the process of how venture capital works. And John Kerry's book just blows that all open. It's like, no, it's so easy to scam it. Like, It's so easy to be a con artist in Silicon Valley. Like, it's not special geniuses. It's just people who are making bets, and some of the bets work and some don't. And like, it's really easy to scam those people.
So Carreyrou's book, for those who aren't familiar with it, is the book about Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes, and based on Carreyrou's reporting for the Wall Street Journal, which came out last year.
It was very like The Emperor Has No Clothes, that one, which of course, as someone who's here and reporting on these people and kind of taking it seriously every day, it was fun to be able to not take it seriously.
What isn't being covered? If it's not being covered enough, like what aspects do you feel like people still don't really have a good sense of if they are not within that world of Silicon Valley?
Enormous swaths of it. I read more stories about like 15 blocks in Bushwick than I do about Palo Alto any week of the year. Mm-hmm. There is an enormous dearth of reporting out here. I think so much of how this place works, so many scams, so much nonsense is just laying around to be written about. And then I think even the implication of what these platforms mean is we're still just scratching the surface of understanding that. The fact of every human on Earth being able to be connected on a platform is still an unreal thing that we don't even understand. And then the number of people who are deciding all of that, like I want profiles of like every major Facebook engineer. I think there's so much here.
It sounds like what you're saying in a way, though, is that in Coders, we're getting a sense of a very small group of people whose work has tremendous implications that we haven't yet grappled with, and that therefore it's also really important not only what these people are doing, but who they are.
We forget how small these companies actually are, how few people are making these decisions, and how incredibly powerful they are. And we need to know who these people are.
Well, we need to read that book next then. Maybe you'll write it, Nellie.
Oh my God, I've tried. It's too hard.
Nellie, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Nellie Bowles is a tech and culture reporter for the New York Times based in San Francisco. And this week in the book review, she writes about Coders, the making of a new tribe and the remaking of the world, the new book by Clive Thompson. April is National Poetry Month, and as a way to acknowledge and celebrate it and spread some poetry around, we are inviting a poet each week to come on and read from a favorite poem. This week, Marie Howe is reading The Annunciation by Rainier Maria Rilke.
The Annunciation. It isn't just that an angel entered. Realize this is not what startled her. She might have been somebody else, and the angel some sunlight. Or at night, the moon occupying itself in her room. So quietly, she accustomed herself to the form he took. She barely suspected that this kind of visit is exhausting to angels. Oh, if we knew how pure she was. Didn't a deer catching sight of her once in the forest lose itself so much in looking at her that without coupling, it conceived the unicorn, the animal of light, the pure animal. It's not just that he walked in, but that he placed the face of a young man so close to hers, his gaze, and the one with which she answered it blended so much suddenly that everything else vanished. And what millions saw, built, and endured, crowded inside of her, only her and him, seen and seen, I am whatever is beautiful to the eye, nowhere else but right here. This is startling, and it startled them both. Then the angel sang his song.
Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues Sarah Lyle, Tina Jordan, and John Williams are here. Hi, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Hi.
All right, let's start with you, Sarah. What are you reading?
Well, I just started last night, actually, Nell Freudenberger's Lost and Wanted. And, so often you read things because of what's going on in your own head and your own life. And I was looking for something that was both meaty and interesting, but also had a good plot. And I was reading, actually, our review of it. And it sounded exactly what I'm looking for, because I've been thinking a lot about old friends and lost friends and people who are out of your lives and people who've died and your relationship with them. And it's about a woman who is a physicist, and she has an old friend from college who she just learns has died. And they were very, very close, and then they weren't so close. And the book takes up in her head as she ponders their relationship and ponders what happened to their friendship and ponders what this friend of hers was like. And there's a lot of science in it. I've really just started it. I started it last night because I felt a little bit sad about my own friend and was looking for something to sort of take me out of my own head. But it's affecting me a lot already. I love the science wrapped up in it. There's a lot of stuff that's too hard to understand, but I think if you read really slowly, maybe you'll get it, or I will, or somebody will, and read it a couple times. But a lot about the notion of time and sort of different realities at the same time. And it reminds me a lot of, after I saw the film Arrival a couple years ago, which is about a linguist who's called to help decipher these messages from aliens who've landed on Earth, and it's a very profound film. And I went back and read the short story it was based on by Ted Chiang. And this book reminds me a lot of that also. It's about the sort of conjunction between emotion and science and memory and loss, and how, in a way, if you try really hard, all of your realities can exist at the same time, and people that you knew who are no longer there can still exist for you. And the sort of profundity of someone's relationship with someone who's gone is just as important as what it was like in a way when they were there. And so I've been thinking a lot about that. And the book is beautifully written. It's a wonderful story, and there's wonderful ideas, and it has really good little sentences. She's talking about her friend, and she says she was able to tell a story in a way that appeared to impart information, distracting you with well-chosen details, but ultimately hid more than it revealed. It feels a little bit like that. This book is sort of like that. And there's another couple things when she's starting to talk about time. In our discipline, we're taught to think about time with a flexibility that transcends the ordinary experience of it. I think that's so profound. And she says she's thinking about whether one's conclusions as a scientist, especially with regard to cosmological time, are different because we're older. And I certainly feel that way as an older than I used to be person.
You're not old yet.
It's all relative.
We're all older than we used to be.
Yeah, some more than others.
I've never read any books by Nell Freudenberger. Have you?
Nor have I. And here's the thing. I always got her confused with someone else, who I'm not going to say who it was because their names are slightly familiar, and I didn't like the other person's writing. So I always thought it was the same person. And it wasn't until I read our review, which was so great, which made it clear that it wasn't the same person, that I'm like, and I'd luckily been sent this book, by the publisher, and I had it downstairs in my discard pile because I thought it was written by the other person. I picked it up last night, and I was so happy I did it.
You're very good about not slipping about that other person. So off air, we're going to have a fun talk.
Yeah, you can all speculate, and maybe I'll tell you later.
Yeah, feel free to email us at books@nytimes.com if you have any personal guesses. Tina, what about you?
So I'm reading a book called Murder by the Book by Claire Harmon, and it's about a crime that shocked London in May of 1840 it's fantastic, when a minor aristocrat, the third son of a wealthy family, in his 70s, was discovered with his throat cut in his Mayfair home. And it was such a shocking murder that it captivated the city. Even young Queen Victoria noted it in her diary. It was a time of unrest in London. It was actually right after the assassination attempt on Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, if anybody is into British history like I am. But anyway, so this caught on immediately, and I just want to read you the lines. The crime soon had all of London talking, from the thieves' dens of Soho to Buckingham Palace itself. And for the first time, perhaps, politicians weren't the only people being blamed for undermining the status quo and stirring up the volatile underclass. And what that means is that the man who was ultimately accused of the murder, who was very clearly the main suspect from the start, the man's Swiss valet, said that he had been influenced by serials in newspapers. And that was at a time when newspapers serialized novels all the time. And the reason was that putting novels within newspapers fattened up their pages, and they could no longer be taxed as newspapers, which were taxed very heavily. They could call themselves pamphlets. And so that's why everyone was serialized. And popular at that time, even Dickens, honestly, who's a character in the book, were, these criminals. Like, the life of crime was glorified in many of these novels. And so this, in fact, basically became a trial, and I'm not done with the book yet, in which the accused man said, "Reading novels made me kill." So
that happens to me all the time.
All the time,
Always
right?
my excuse, every time.
But the book is also just stuffed with details about life in 1840s London. You feel like you know how it smelled on the street and what it looked like and what people were eating and what they were reading. And I love that kind of thing. It almost reads like a novel.
That sounds great.
It's great. John, what are you reading?
Sarah said that you sometimes read because of what's going on in your head, which is true enough. But I sometimes read just because of this podcast, which can be very stressful for me. And so there are a couple of reasons I can't talk about what I've been reading lately. One is that I have a review coming up of a book that we haven't reviewed yet. Another is that I'm reading something that is very anticipated and new, but that neither of our reviews have run yet, by someone whose name rhymes with Ballymooney, and I'll talk about that in the future. So I'm going back to something I read a couple of weeks ago, which was a short collection by the Spanish novelist Javier Marias, who I've really wanted to read for a long time, but it's quite difficult to figure out exactly where to start. He's got a large oeuvre at this point, and I do want to dive into his novels soon, but this is a little delectable collection of mini biographies of writers. It's called Written Lives. I think that they originally ran in a Spanish newspaper or magazine. They were collected here about a decade ago. And they're these quirky little angles on people that you know really well, like Faulkner and Conrad and Nabokov and other people like Malcolm Lowry and Mishima, who you might not know quite as well. And they don't aim to be the life. They're just these little portraits of either moments in their life or little traits that they had that he finds charming or perplexing, and with photographs of them. And so it's something you can just put down by your bed and read one or two every night, like candy. You shouldn't eat candy before bed. And get through it that way. So I kind of picked my way through it over the course of maybe a month or so. And Christopher Benfey reviewed it for the Times back when it came out. And he has this one part that kind of gets at what the book's aims are, where he says, Marius prefers subjects who demonstrate reticence and mystery. So enigmatic was Isaac Dinesen when she first traveled to America in 1959 that a flurry of rumors preceded her. And this is Marius writing. She is, in fact, a man. He is, in fact, a woman. Isaac Dinesen is actually two people. She's from Paris, really. He lives in Elsinore. She writes in French. No, in English. No, in Danish. And he puts these sort of glosses on the characters, and he almost treats them like they're fictional characters rather than real-life writers. And I found it very charming. But it's time to dive into his real work. And Sarah, I could tell from when I mentioned his name that you'll have opinions, so we can talk after about where to begin.
Does he write long discursive sentences as well? Because that's what his fiction is like.
No,
it's
I think maybe because this was for a journal of some type, it's much more accessible than that. So it's not a difficult place to start. Pamela, what about you? What are you reading?
I read about 6 books in the last week, which never happens, but only happened because I went to Paris by myself for 6 days, which is, that's the one.
That never happens either.
That never happens, or does not happen enough. But it did. I'm only going to talk about, I think, 2 of the books. I mentioned that I would talk about Leigh Bardugo and her Grisha verse, but I'm just having read the first in the trilogy and now moving on to the second. I will save that and talk about 2 books that I also read. One, I think, Tina, you discussed, The Unwinding of the Miracle by Julie Yip Williams.
Yes.
This is a book that, you're either going to pick this book up or you're not. For me, it's like catnip because it's tragic and horrible and someone dies at the end, and that's the way I like it. It's a little bit like if When Breath Becomes Air by Paul Kalanithi was your thing, then this is for you. And it shared some things with that book. This is a memoir by the late Julie Yip Williams, who died at the age of 42 in 2015, I think, of colon cancer. She was diagnosed at age 37 with stage 4 colon cancer. And she tells that story and a sort of miracle of her life to begin with, because she was born in Vietnam, blind. She had severe cataracts, and her grandmother urged her parents to kill her in order to not have to bring up a blind child in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. Obviously, they didn't kill her, but she ended up escaping from Vietnam. She was an ethnic Chinese, and they were sort of given dispensation. It was kind of a form of ethnic cleansing to leave Vietnam via a fishing boat to Hong Kong. That journey took a month. And if you can imagine, I think it was like 342 people aboard this tiny fishing ship, like one up against the other for a month. She was 3 years old at the time and eventually made her way to America, where she really fought very hard against low expectations from not only from her grandmother, but also from her parents, and ended up going to Williams College and to Harvard Law School and to becoming a lawyer at Cleary Gottlieb, where she then met her husband, got married, and had 2 kids, only to be struck down by cancer at an early age. And so it's very dark and tragic. There are uplifting moments, brief, but I ended the book sobbing in a cafe in Paris, which I guess is, the best way to read a book like that. It was interesting. One thing, I don't know, Tina, if this struck you too, I can't remember if Lucy Kalanithi had an afterword to Paul Kalanithi's book. Did she?
I think she did.
She did, yes.
She did.
Yeah.
Well, I thought this was interesting. The husband, who's really silent throughout the book, he's a character, but she doesn't write too much about him. He writes an afterword without giving much away. I will say that it really does shift your perspective on the entire book.
How? Why?
Well, it's a little bit like, it's like marriage therapy in a way, where you hear one person's perspective and you're totally on that person's side, and we completely get Julie and her view of the world and of herself and of her family and her marriage. And then at the very last minute, you have the husband step in and be like, well, here's what I have to say.
Well, how is it different? How does it give you a different perspective?
I would say that Julie comes across as extremely self-aware. But one thing that we all know about memoir is that no matter how honest someone is, we're getting it from their perspective, and that everyone does not always know themselves best or entirely. And so to read what her husband has to say about having gone through that experience is interesting. So one thing Julie does point out is that the minute she gets diagnosed, right, her whole being is focused on, if not survival, then what to do with the rest of her life. Where by definition, her husband is going to be focused on, also survival of the wife, but to a greater extent, what do I do after she's gone? And so what he makes clear in his afterword, for one thing, is that from the instant she was sort of diagnosed, or at least when her diagnosis became terminal, that they were on very different paths. And so throughout the book, you're kind of thinking like they're a team and they're in this together. But ultimately, what his afterword brought home for me is that actually she was very much on her own in a lot of ways. And it's not to fault him. It's completely natural. But his whole sort of shift of the future, his vision of the future is very different from hers. Wow. Did that strike you, Tina?
It did, but to me, it just reinforced the whole idea that this woman began blogging. The book was born out of her blog because she was trying to figure out how to die. I mean, she read Paul Kalanithe's book, but as you know, he stopped writing at a certain point, 8 months or a year before he died. And she was struggling for like a roadmap. You know, and you're dying, you are in it by yourself. She was trying to set things up for her kids and her husband and decorate the apartment and make sure that they had haircut appointments for the next, 3 years or whatever. But more fundamentally, she was trying to figure out how to die.
Yeah. If you like to cry, this is a book for you. So that's either a recommendation or a warning for me. I really appreciated it. And the other book that I read and finished last night was To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, obviously. And obviously not the first time I read it. I read it when it was assigned in school, like we all read it probably for the first time, probably when I was around 12 years old. And I have to say, I think I read it too young. I did not fully appreciate it. And one of the things that I did not fully appreciate was that at the time that I read it, I did not have enough of an education in what the South was really like to understand that this was not a fable. There was no exaggeration in terms of her depiction of race. And that so the idea of Boo Radley at the very beginning, you're seeing it as a ghost story, like a little bit fantastical, a little bit of a mystery. And that set me up as a very young, more naive reader to think that maybe the whole book kind of existed a little bit on that plane. And when I reread it now, you realize that, no, this was reality. And the trial of Tom Robinson and the outcome, which I thought I was as disbelieving as the character Scout is and her brother Jem and their friend Dill, because I was that age. So I saw it through their eyes, and I could not imagine that he would be found guilty, having read it as a child. When you read it as an adult, you realize, of course, he's going to be found guilty. So it was a very different reading experience. Maybe it is good to read it at both ages. I don't know. Have you all read it as an adult?
I read it all the time. I read it every couple of years. I think it's an amazing book in part because I think there's 4 or 5 or I think 3 separate places where it almost comes to a climax. And one of them is when the neighbor who's trying to come off morphine, that moment where she dies and Atticus says, she was the bravest woman I ever knew. And you've sort of started to think in this terms of seeing people from 2 different perspectives. She was an awful woman. She was an amazing woman. Then the moment of the trial, obviously, and that thing that always makes me cry when Calpurnia says, stand up, Miss Jean Louise, your father's passing. I just cry thinking about it. And then, of course, at the very end, that incredible scene with when Scout is dressed as a ham and she comes home and she sees that man standing there in the shadows, and her father says, "Thank you, Mr. Radley," or "Thank you, Arthur, for my children." And it's so beautiful. And I think it's so extraordinary on so many levels. But again, just as a novel with an amazing plot and amazing writing and an amazing, propulsion through the story. And I think it's really cool to read stuff when you're older that you also read when you're younger, because you're a different person and you see it through a different lens.
I think that one thing that became clear to me rereading it now too was, especially after all of the kind of craziness around Go Set a Watchman and all of that, you realize you get a sense of why it was so hard for her to ever write another book, because she did write a masterpiece.
It's
perfect. It's a
perfect
novel.
Yeah.
All right. Let's go quickly through what we all read. Sarah?
I read Nell Freudenberger, Lost and Wanted.
I read Murder by the Book, The Crime That Shocked Dickens' London by Claire Harmon.
John?
I read Written Lives by Javier Marias.
And I read The Unwinding of the Miracle by Julie Yip Williams and To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thank you, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, albeit not right away. The Book Review Podcast is produced by Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media with the great help of my colleague, Don Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.